The cat sitting on your couch right now has never been fully domesticated. Not really. It lives in your home, eats from your hand, purrs against your leg, and yet, genetically, it is barely distinguishable from a wild animal stalking rodents across the desert. Rather than undergoing the strong selective breeding and population bottlenecks typical of domestic species, cats effectively self-domesticated, without losing ancestral traits, such as their hunting behavior. Every other animal we call domestic was captured, broken, selectively bred across generations until something fundamentally wild was replaced with something fundamentally compliant. The cat never went through that. It walked into human civilization on its own terms, and it has never entirely surrendered them. That single fact changes everything about how we understand domestication. And it raises a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be anything but. How do you domesticate something that was never captured? Now, every other domesticated animal. Let's start there, because the contrast matters. Think about cattle.
Genetic research indicates that modern taurine cattle arose from roughly 80 aurochs tamed in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria about 10,500 years ago. 80 animals, out of entire wild populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The first archaeological evidence for wild aurochs domestication appears in the Anatolian Fertile Crescent around 10,500 years ago, where cattle breeding developed for the next 2 millennia before reaching Greece and spreading further into Europe. 2,000 years of deliberate human management to produce an animal that would reliably stay where you put it. Before that process, the aurochs was one of the most dangerous animals in Europe. Julius Caesar described it as barely smaller than an elephant, nearly as fast as a horse, and lethal when cornered. Ancient hunters prized killing one as a proof of manhood, and Neolithic farmers looked at that animal and decided to make it into livestock.
That is a project requiring extraordinary patience and extraordinary control. You select the individuals that don't panic when humans approach. You breed them together. You remove the ones that attack. You do this across 50, 60, 70 human generations. You build corrals, fences, breeding programs. The animal doesn't choose any of this. It is shaped by it. Horses were the same story. An international team of researchers found evidence that Kazakhstan's bowtie culture was breeding and harnessing horses and drinking their milk 5,500 years ago. The steppe zones east of the Ural Mountains in northern Kazakhstan were known to have been prime habitat for wild horses thousands of years ago. They were a commonly hunted animal. People who hunted horses eventually figured out that the animal could be captured, controlled, and ridden. Butchered horse remains found at bowtie sites include slender lower leg bones like those of later domesticated horses, and cheek teeth worn down by bits that attached to bridles or similar restraints. Bits in the teeth. That's the archaeological signature of domestication for horses. A piece of metal or bone forced into the animal's mouth to steer it. That is not an animal that volunteered. Two main theories seek to explain how the wolf became domesticated. One imagines a scenario where humans collected pups from the den and brought them back to their settlement. There, the humans fed, raised, and socialized them with human pack members. Over time, humans kept the most docile wolves, while driving away or killing those that were too aggressive. Wolves became dogs through a combination of human capture, selection pressure, and thousands of years of forced proximity. People bred domestic dogs for thousands of years based on their skills and personalities. They needed dogs to hunt, to herd, to guard. Every breed you've ever seen, the Border Collie's obsessive focus, the Bloodhound's nose, the Greyhound's speed, is the product of humans deciding what the next generation of animals would look like. Dogs are walking monuments to human intention. And the wild boar, the ancestor of every domestic pig, captured in traps, penned in enclosures, bred for slower growth and fatter bodies, fed grain that would have been foreign to their natural diet. Same with sheep, descended from the mouflon, a skittish mountain animal that needed centuries of selection before it would stand still in a field and let a human shear it. Same with goats, with donkeys, with the domestic chicken, which traces back to the red jungle fowl of Southeast Asia. In every case, the pattern is identical. Humans identify a useful wild animal, apply force or selective pressure or captive breeding, and over generations reshape the creature into something that serves human purposes. Whereas other, once wild animals were domesticated for their milk, meat, wool, or labor, cats contribute virtually nothing in the way of sustenance or work. They don't pull plows. You can't milk them. They're not large enough to carry loads. You can't eat them, or rather, people historically didn't eat them in any systematic way. By every logic of Neolithic agriculture, the cat had nothing to offer that would justify the enormous effort of capturing and breeding a wild felid. And yet, here it is. 600 million of them, living in human homes across every continent. Something very different happened. 10,000 years ago, the Fertile Crescent was undergoing the most consequential transformation in human history. Hunter-gatherers were becoming farmers. Cats began their unique relationship with humans 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, the geographic region where some of the earliest developments in human civilization occurred.
One such development was agriculture. As people abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and settled permanently to farm the land, stored grain attracted rodents. This sounds almost too simple, but the ecological cascade it triggered was profound, and it happened fast by evolutionary standards. Early settlements in the Fertile Crescent, between 9,000 and 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period, created a completely new environment for any wild animals sufficiently flexible and curious to exploit it. The house mouse was one such creature. Archaeologists have found remains of this rodent, which originated in the Indian subcontinent, among the first human stores of wild grain from Israel, dating to around 10,000 years ago. The house mice could not compete well with the local wild mice outside, but by moving into people's homes and silos, they thrived. Think about what this created. A Neolithic grain store was essentially a permanent, concentrated food source that never moved, never fought back, and never ran dry between harvests. For a rodent, it was paradise. Mice and rats flooded into these settlements in numbers that would have seemed almost plague-like to the farmers watching their carefully accumulated food supplies disappear. They gnawed through storage vessels. They contaminated everything they touched. One bad winter with unchecked rodents could wipe out a community's entire food reserve. Grain stores and refuse from developing societies attracted mice, which led to a synanthropic relationship between humans, rodents, and felids. That word, synanthropic, means living alongside humans. It describes an animal that benefits from human presence without being domesticated by it. Crows around a garbage dump are synanthropic. Rats in a subway are synanthropic. And for a while, the wildcats of the Near East were too. As humans transitioned from hunter-gatherers to farmers around 12,000 years ago, bold wildcats likely capitalized on increased prey density, rodents. Humans benefited from the cat's predation on these vermin. Nobody planned this. No Neolithic farmer sat down and decided to cultivate a population of wildcats. What happened was simpler and stranger. The mice came to the grain. The cats came for the mice. And the humans noticed that wherever the cats hunted, the rodent damage was less.
Wildcats, attracted by the reliable food source of rodents around granaries, began to tolerate proximity to humans. Farmers, observing the cat's pest control effectiveness, began to tolerate and eventually encourage their presence. Food scraps were left out. Cats edged closer. Over generations, the individuals least fearful of humans reproduced most successfully in this niche. This is the crucial detail. No human hand reached out and grabbed a wildcat. No wildcat was put in a pen. What happened was purely ecological. An environment changed. A food opportunity opened. The animals with a specific behavioral trait, a slightly higher tolerance for proximity to humans, a slightly lower panic response when people walked near. Those animals ate more, survived better, had more offspring. Their offspring inherited that trait. Natural selection, operating on a population of cats that chose to be near humans, gradually shifted the average temperament of the group over hundreds of generations. This is what scientists call the commensal pathway to domestication. The animal is not captured or selectively bred by humans, but instead adapts itself to human environments through natural selection. The cat, in a very real sense, chose us. Every other domestic animal was domesticated through human agency. The cat domesticated itself. And the result is an animal that is 10,000 years deep into a relationship with us, and still, in some fundamental ways, wild.
The first hard physical evidence of this relationship isn't a tool or a carving. It's a grave. At the Neolithic site of Shilurokambos, near Limassol in Cyprus, archaeologists unearthed a remarkable burial dating to 9,500 years ago. In 2004, Jean-Denis Vigne of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris and his colleagues reported the discovery. An adult human of unknown gender laid to rest in a shallow grave with an 8-month-old African wildcat buried just 40 centimeters away. The two graves were oriented identically, the placement deliberate, accompanied by seashells, polished stone tools, and other offerings that mirror the treatment given to the human. Stop for a second and feel the weight of that. 9,500 years ago. Someone, a farmer, a hunter, a village leader, a person whose name we will never know, died. And when they were buried, a cat was interred nearby, with the same care and the same offerings given to the human body. That's not pest control. That's something else entirely. Cats are not native to Cyprus, so Neolithic people must have intentionally brought them by boat from the mainland, not for hunting or farming, but apparently for companionship. Think about what that means logistically. Somebody crossed the Mediterranean, or at least a significant stretch of open water, with a cat. Not a cow, not a goat, not a grain store. A cat. A creature that, at this stage in history, was at most semi-tame. Moving a live wildcat on a boat is not a casual undertaking. The find, published in Science by Vigne's team, predates Egyptian cat depictions by over 4,000 years. For generations, the popular story of cat domestication began in ancient Egypt, the temples, the goddess Bastet, the mummified offerings. The ancient Egyptians were generally thought to have been the first to domesticate cats, breeding them to produce a distinct new species around 4,000 to 3,900 years ago. One grave in Cyprus demolished that timeline with a single discovery. Vigne was careful to point out that humans apparently had not yet bred cats into different species at that time. This cat is not morphologically different from the wildcat, he explained. And this detail matters enormously. The cat buried in Cyprus was not a domestic animal in any morphological sense. Its bones looked like a wildcat's bones. It was the same size, the same proportions, the same structure as the Felis sylvestris libica running free across the deserts of the Near East at that moment.
What had changed was not the animal's body. What had changed was the relationship. This is the paradox at the heart of cat domestication. It left almost no physical trace for thousands of years. You can tell a domesticated cow from a wild aurochs by the size of its bones. Domestication shrinks cattle rapidly and measurably. You can tell a domestic dog from a wolf by the skull shape, the brain size, the tooth structure. But a domestic cat from 9,000 years ago looks almost identical to the wild ancestor it descended from. The domestication process seemingly did not profoundly alter the morphological, physiological, behavioral, and ecological features of cats, in contrast to what has been observed for dogs. So what did change? What actually happened to the cat's genome over 10,000 years of living alongside humans? That question, for most of the 20th century, had no answer. The bones told you nothing. The behavior offered clues, but clues are not data. The answer had to wait for genetics, and for one particular study that would rewrite everything.
In 2007, a team of researchers led by Carlos Driscoll, working simultaneously at Oxford University and the National Cancer Institute in Maryland, set out to answer a question that sounds deceptively simple. Where did the domestic cat come from? Carlos Driscoll and his colleagues surveyed 979 cats from around the globe, including wildcats, feral cats, various domesticated breeds, sand cats, and Chinese desert cats. This was not a small study. 979 individual animals, sampled across multiple continents, their DNA sequenced and compared. Driscoll says that the project grew out of efforts to conserve the surviving wildcats in the Scottish Highlands. Killing them was forbidden, but an accused hunter had protested on the grounds that biology couldn't prove that wildcats differ from domestic cats. That legal dispute, of all things, launched one of the most important genetic studies of animal domestication in history. What Driscoll's team was looking for was a pattern. If regional indigenous groups of wildcats could be distinguished from one another on the basis of their DNA, and if the DNA of domestic cats more closely resembled that of one of the wildcat populations, then there would be clear evidence for where domestication began. The study resolved the wildcat family tree into 5 distinct lineages. One group combined the Near East wild relatives and domestic cats worldwide. All of them. Every domestic cat, the Persian lounging in an apartment in Tokyo, the tabby prowling a Barcelona alleyway, the stray picking through garbage in Lagos, every single one traces its ancestry to a single subspecies in the Near East. DNA shows that domestic cats are most similar to wildcats currently living in the deserts of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. Not European wildcats, not Central Asian wildcats, not the Chinese desert cat. One specific population, in one specific region, at the precise moment when agriculture was being born. Further analysis revealed that cats were domesticated in the Near East, probably coincident with agricultural village development in the Fertile Crescent. Domestic cats derive from at least 5 founders from across this region, whose descendants were transported across the world by human assistance. 5 founders, out of an entire species. That's an almost incomprehensibly narrow origin for an animal now numbering in the hundreds of millions. And unlike the cattle bottleneck, which was the result of humans deliberately selecting and isolating a small breeding population, this bottleneck happened because 5 individual wildcats, or their immediate descendants, happened to be tolerant enough of human proximity to make the leap into the commensal niche. Not because they were captured, because they chose to stay close. That subspecies, the one that started everything, is called Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat.
The African wildcat is an agile, solitary hunter, considered the ancestor of all domestic cats. Although it may seem inconspicuous, it copes perfectly in extreme conditions, from rocky deserts to dense thickets. Look at a photograph of one, and you'll feel a jolt of recognition. It looks almost exactly like a domestic tabby. Same proportions, same basic coat pattern, sandy gray with faint stripes, same yellow-green eyes, same compact muscular build. The resemblance is not a coincidence. The domestic cat has changed so little genetically that the two animals can still interbreed and produce fertile offspring today. Likely the first cat to be domesticated, the African wildcat is somewhat larger and stockier than the modern house cat, with which it interbreeds readily. African wildcats are generally solitary animals, only coming together for mating.
Everything about Felis sylvestris libica should have made it a terrible candidate for domestication. Solitary, territorial, nocturnal, built for ambush predation in open desert environments. The idea of such an animal voluntarily approaching a human settlement and staying there seems counterintuitive to everything we know about wildcat behavior. And yet there was one thing about this particular subspecies that made the impossible possible. Felis sylvestris libica had the good luck of proximity to the first human settlements, and a marginally higher tolerance for close contact with other individuals, including individuals of different species, compared to its European and Asian relatives. It's a subtle difference, barely visible in captive studies, but evolution doesn't need large differences. It needs consistent, heritable differences. A wildcat that panics at 50 meters from a human survives differently from one that stays calm at 20 meters. The calmer individual eats the mice closer to the granary. It eats more. It survives more winters. Its kittens inherit the slightly lower threshold of fear. Over hundreds of generations, that marginal difference becomes a population-level shift. Eventually, enough genetic variation arose between wildcats that lived in human communities and those still out in the wild that a new behavioral phenotype emerged. Humans did not deliberately bring that about, but simply tolerated and welcomed the wildcats that ate the rodents that stole their grain. We did not domesticate wildcats. Wildcats domesticated themselves. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange. Stranger than the origin story, stranger than the cypress grave, stranger even than the genetics of the founder population. Because once we knew where domestic cats came from, and roughly when, the next question was unavoidable. What actually changed in their DNA? After 10,000 years of living with humans, how different is the genome of a domestic cat from the genome of the wild ancestor? The answer, when it finally came from genomic analysis, surprised nearly everyone in the field. Scientists found changes in the domestic cat's genes that other studies have shown are involved in behaviors such as memory, fear, and reward-seeking. Cats, unlike dogs, are really only semi-domesticated, said senior author Wes Warren, associate professor of genetics at the Genome Institute at Washington University. Let that sit for a moment. Semi-domesticated. After 10,000 years. The researchers comparing domestic cat DNA to wildcat DNA had expected to find something dramatic, the kind of sweeping genomic signature that distinguishes a domestic dog from a wolf, with hundreds of genes showing strong selection signals across the entire genome. What they found was far more modest. Compared with wildcat genomes, domestic cat genomes showed evidence of recent selection in genes linked to memory, fear conditioning, and stimulus-reward learning, all related to the evolution of tameness. Domesticated cats would have needed to become less fearful of humans and develop a working memory in order to adapt to new habitats. Memory linked to positive stimuli, fear thresholds,
reward pathways. These are precisely the genes you would expect to shift if domestication happened through the commensal route, not through forced breeding for specific traits, but through natural selection, favoring individuals that could learn to associate humans with safety and food, rather than danger. The cat didn't need to become more obedient, or more cooperative, or more attentive to human signals. It just needed to stop being quite as afraid. The signatures of selection in the domestic cat genome are linked to genes associated with models affecting memory, fear conditioning behavior, and stimulus-reward learning, and potentially point to the processes by which cats became domesticated. Compare this to what happened in dogs. The cat genome appears to have undergone less intense and more recent evolutionary pressure than that of dogs. Not surprising, considering that dogs may have lived with us for up to 30,000 years. Dogs show selection signals across genes involved in starch digestion, social cognition, attention to human faces, response to human gaze, cooperative behavior. They were selected for a relationship. Cats were not selected for a purpose like dogs and other domesticates, one geneticist observes. They just hung out, and humans tolerated them. That asymmetry in the genomic record is one of the most striking findings in the entire field of domestication biology. Dogs were bred into partners, cats drifted into companions. And the DNA reflects that difference with almost perfect clarity. Domestic cats have unusually high genetic diversity compared with most other domestic animals. This is the fingerprint of an animal that was never subjected to severe population bottlenecks or intense selective breeding programs. The diversity stayed high because humans never controlled who mated with whom. Without doors or window panes, Neolithic farmers would have been hard-pressed to control the breeding of cats, even if they wanted to. Cats came, cats left. Cats mated with wild individuals at the edge of the settlement. Wild individuals occasionally entered the human sphere and bred with the semi-tame population. The gene pool stayed wide. Intensive selective breeding in cats only began approximately 200 years ago and has focused almost entirely on aesthetic traits. 200 years out of 10,000. For 9,800 of those years, the cat's genome evolved without any human guidance, shaped entirely by the ecological pressures of the commensal niche. And the result is an animal with a significantly modified behavioral threshold for human proximity, and almost everything else intact. Almost everything. Because what the genome study revealed, the finding that perhaps matters most for understanding what cats actually are, is how spectacularly little changed in the predatory hardware. Domestication around 10,000 years ago imposed negligible genetic alterations to core predatory traits. These mechanisms manifest as a fixed behavioral sequence: initial orientation via visual or auditory cues, followed by stealthy stalking or ambush positioning, a brief chase if the prey flees, pouncing with forelimbs to pin using retractable claws, and delivery of a killing bite to the prey's neck or skull base, severing the spinal cord for rapid immobilization. Cats have retractable claws that are kept sharp and silent until needed. A cat's binocular vision provides exceptional depth perception, allowing them to accurately judge distances when hunting prey. Their eyes also have a tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer that enhances night vision, making them effective hunters in low-light conditions. Their hearing can detect frequencies up to 64,000 Hz, letting them discern subtle sounds like rustling or ultrasonic calls. Sensitive whiskers detect air currents and spatial constraints, helping them feel their prey even in darkness. None of this softened. None of this was traded away for the warmth and the food bowl and the safe sleeping spot. The retractable claw is as sharp in a pampered indoor cat as it is in a wildcat patrolling a desert wadi. The tapetum lucidum behind the domestic cat's retina functions identically to the one behind the African wildcat's retina.
The ambush instinct, the freeze, the low crouch, the tail tip twitch, the explosive launch, fires in a cat lying on a living room carpet with the same neurological precision as it fires in an animal that has never seen the inside of a building. From the ancestral wildcats to the modern-day domestic cat, their predatory instincts have remained largely unchanged. The predatory drive operates independently of hunger, as an appetitive behavior decoupled from feeding, enabling surplus killing where multiple prey are dispatched beyond immediate nutritional need. A well-fed domestic cat will still hunt, not because it's hungry, because it was built to hunt. And 10,000 years of living in human homes wasn't enough time to dismantle the machinery. This is what makes the cat genuinely unlike any other domestic animal. The dog was reshaped at a deep level to fit the human social world, its aggression muted, its social cognition rewired, its attention pivoted toward human faces and human gestures. The cow's entire body plan was transformed, smaller, slower, docile where the aurochs was lethal. The horse's panic response was systematically bred down over millennia. In every case, domestication involved a fundamental redesign of the animal's core nature. The cat changed its fear response toward humans and left everything else exactly as it was. Researchers have argued that cats, although domesticated, still essentially remained independent of humans, chiefly because their feeding ecology has hardly changed since domestication. The fundamental feature of cats may be their basically unchanged role as a predator. Think about what this means for the cat on your couch. The same animal that bats at your hand for attention has eyes designed to track moving prey in near-total darkness. Retractable weapons kept sheathed until the moment of the strike. An ambush strategy encoded so deeply in the neural architecture that a kitten born in a sterile laboratory environment will still crouch, stalk, and pounce at any moving target it encounters. You didn't give it those tools. You didn't shape them. You didn't even dull them. And that raises the question that sits at the center of everything we've been discussing, and that the genomics of cat domestication haven't fully resolved. If the predatory hardware is unchanged, if the genetic diversity is anomalously high, if selective breeding didn't start until 200 years ago, if wild and domestic cats can still interbreed freely across their shared ranges, is the domestic cat actually domestic? Or is it something else? Something that doesn't have a clean biological category yet? Something that made a deal with humanity and kept one hand free? Carlos Driscoll had been staring at phylogenetic trees for months when the pattern finally locked into place. It was 2007, and he was working simultaneously between Oxford and the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. A collaboration that had grown, of all things, out of a Scottish courtroom dispute about whether a wildcat accused of mating with domestic cats was genetically distinguishable from them. That legal question sent Driscoll and his team across 3 continents with sample kits, collecting DNA from wildcats in the Scottish Highlands, from feral cats in Israel, from cats in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Southern Africa, China. 979 individuals in total. It was, at the time, the largest genetic survey of any wild felid ever conducted. When the sequencing came back, Driscoll ran the analysis looking for structure, for the clusters and divergences in the data that would reveal how the world's wildcat populations related to each other, and where domestic cats fit into that picture. What he expected was complexity. What he found was almost disorienting in its clarity. Every single domestic cat on the planet, every breed, every stray, every feral colony from Tokyo to Tangier collapsed into a single cluster. And that cluster sat, unmistakably and completely, within the Near Eastern wildcat population. Not near it, not adjacent to it, inside it. Driscoll later described the finding this way: the genetic signal was so clean that it pointed not just to a region, but to a specific ecological moment. The data didn't just say Near East,
It said, "This particular population, in this particular habitat, at the moment when grain agriculture was beginning." The timing and the geography aligned with a precision that you almost never get in evolutionary biology, where the signals are usually murky and the interpretations contested. This one was clean. The number struck the team as much as the location did. 5 founders, 5 individual lineages from which all domestic cats descend. For an animal now numbering in the hundreds of millions, that's a starting population so small it barely registers. And yet, unlike every other domestication event that produced a genetic bottleneck, cattle narrowed from wild populations of hundreds of thousands, horses selected from specific steppe herds, dogs funneled through deliberate human breeding, the domestic cat's narrow founding was not followed by the kind of reduced genetic diversity you'd expect. The cats kept breeding with wildcats at the edges of settlements. Wild individuals kept drifting into the human sphere and back out again. The boundary between wild and domestic remained, for most of cat history, essentially permeable. Driscoll's co-investigator Stephen O'Brien, a geneticist at the National Cancer Institute, who had spent decades mapping the genomes of wild felids, framed it this way. Domestic cats are, in genetic terms, barely distinguishable from their wild ancestors. Not because domestication failed, but because domestication in cats worked through an entirely different mechanism than in any other animal. The process of cat domestication was not orchestrated by human design, the team wrote in their science paper. Domestication of cats may have only required cats to develop a tolerance for humans. That single sentence rewrote the taxonomy of what domestication even means. Now, to understand why Felis sylvestris libica, and only Felis sylvestris libica, could make that tolerance shift, you have to understand what this animal looks like in the field. Not in a zoo, not in a laboratory, in the open landscape of the Near Eastern desert, where the researchers who study it most closely have had to sit for hours in hides, sweating, barely breathing, to watch one long enough to understand it. Wildlife biologist Leslie Lyons, who has spent years studying the genetics of small felids at the University of Missouri, has described field work with African wildcats as an exercise in patience that borders on meditation. The animal moves through its territory, typically several square kilometers for a single individual, with an economy of motion that has been refined over millions of years of ambush predation. It does not hurry. It does not panic easily. When it detects a threat, its first response is not flight. It freezes. It watches. It evaluates. Only when it determines that the threat is real and immediate does it move. That behavioral profile, freeze, evaluate, decide, turns out to be the critical difference between Felis sylvestris libica and every other wildcat subspecies. European wildcats, the ones that live in Scottish forests and Iberian mountains, have a hair-trigger flight response that makes them among the most difficult of all small felids to study in the wild. Researchers studying the Scottish wildcat have described situations where the animal fled at distances greater than 100 meters, bolting before a human even came into clear view. Any attempt to habituate a European wildcat to human presence requires years of captive breeding programs, and even then, the animals frequently remain what biologists call untamable in any practical sense. Their fear response is baked in at a level that selective pressure from human proximity cannot easily reach. The African wildcat's response to perceived threat is measurably different. Field researchers working in the semi-arid zones of the Near East and North Africa have documented cases of Felis sylvestris libica holding its position at distances of 15 to 20 meters from a stationary human observer. Not because it hasn't detected the person, but because it has detected them, calculated the threat level, and decided the calculation doesn't yet require flight. It's watching. It's still, and in that stillness, In that evaluative pause before the decision to flee, you can see the behavioral raw material from which domestication was built. One researcher studying wildcat behavior in the Negev desert described watching a Felis sylvestris libica sit at the edge of a Bedouin encampment for 3 consecutive evenings, stationary in the shadow of a low rock wall, watching the camp's activity with what he characterized as calm curiosity rather than alarm. The animal ate a mouse it had caught near the camp's grain storage. It watched children moving inside the encampment boundary. It did not flee when a dog barked. On the 4th evening, it was gone. But those 3 evenings of observation, of a wild animal choosing to stay in a human space rather than flee it, were exactly the behavioral phenotype that, in a Neolithic grain storage context 10,000 years ago, would have been selected for. The calmer animal ate. The calmer animal survived. The less fearful cats reproduced in greater numbers and passed their less fearful traits onto their offspring. Generation by generation, cats that lived in and around human settlements became progressively tamer. All of this happened without deliberate human intervention. The first domestic cats were, in essence, self-selected for a single behavioral trait. And that one trait was enough to change the course of species history. Now step back from that desert observation post and into a genomics laboratory, because here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. When researchers sequenced domestic cat genomes against African wildcat genomes and compared the results, looking for the regions of DNA where selection had acted most strongly, the signal they found was real, but it was quiet. Almost whisper quiet, compared to what anyone working on dog domestication would consider a typical domestication signature. The genomic regions showing the strongest signs of selection in domestic cats clustered around genes involved in 3 specific systems: fear conditioning, reward-associated learning, and memory consolidation. In molecular terms, the research found selection signals near genes associated with Williams-Buren syndrome, a human condition involving extraordinary social ease and fearlessness, and in the dopaminergic and serotonergic pathways that regulate how strongly an individual responds to positive social stimuli. Wes Warren, the senior author of the genomic study and a specialist in genome assembly at Washington University, was careful to note what these changes were and, crucially, what they were not. There were modifications to the threshold at which the cat's nervous system flags a human encounter as threatening rather than neutral, and modifications to the circuitry that allows a positive experience, being fed, being touched without harm, to be encoded as a memorable association rather than a meaningless one. They were not changes to temperament, cognition, social structure, dietary metabolism, or sensory hardware. The cat's ability to digest starch did not increase significantly, unlike in dogs and humans, which developed more copies of the salivary amylase gene for starch digestion after switching to agricultural diets. The domestic cat is still an obligate carnivore. Its brain did not expand its social processing regions. Its attention did not pivot toward human faces the way a dog's attention pivots. It did not develop the capacity to read human pointing gestures that dogs acquired, a capacity which researchers discovered wolves entirely lack, meaning it was bred into dogs specifically. The cat never developed it at all. Warren described the contrast between dog and cat domestication as night and day in terms of genomic depth. Dogs show selection signatures across genes spanning nearly every major system in the animal's biology: digestion, neurology, morphology, behavior, social cognition. The dog's genome looks like an organism that was thoroughly redesigned. The cat's genome looks like an organism that adjusted one dial and left the rest of the panel untouched. Cats, unlike dogs, are really only semi-domesticated, Warren said. He wasn't being provocative. He was reading the data. And here is where the thing that didn't change becomes more interesting than the thing that did. Spend a few hours watching a domestic cat. Not a cat playing with a toy, but a cat hunting. Not the theatrical pounce onto a feather wand, a cat that has gone outside and located actual prey. Watch the sequence unfold. First, the freeze. Every muscle locks simultaneously. The weight drops imperceptibly lower on the legs. The tail stops its ambient motion. Then, the lock. The eyes fix and narrow, the pupils adjusting. The binocular vision constructing a precise three-dimensional map of the target's position and trajectory. Then, the stalk. Movement so controlled that each paw is placed with deliberate, rolling precision, the heel landing last to eliminate the sound of impact. A gait pattern so biomechanically specific that it has its own name in felid locomotion studies. Then, the launch. An explosive burst of acceleration from a near-stationary position, the forelimbs extending to pin, the retractable claws deploying at the exact moment of contact to prevent escape. And finally, if the prey is large enough to require it, the killing bite. A precisely targeted strike at the base of the skull, where the spinal cord meets the brainstem, that severs the connection between brain and body with neurological efficiency. That sequence was not softened by 10,000 years of living with humans. Not one element of it. The retractable claw, which is itself a remarkable piece of evolutionary engineering, kept sheathed to stay sharp and silent until the precise moment it's needed. Unlike the permanently extended claws of dogs or the dew claws of other mammals, is as geometrically perfect in a cat born in an apartment in Stockholm as it is in a wildcat that has never seen a human. The tapetum lucidum, the reflective membrane behind the retina that doubles the effective light hitting the photoreceptors and turns a cat's eyes into the luminous discs you see in a flashlight beam at night, functions identically in both animals. The frequency range of feline hearing, extending to around 64,000 Hz, high enough to detect the ultrasonic calls that rodents use to communicate, hasn't shifted. The vibrissae, the whiskers, which are not merely tactile hairs, but sophisticated sensory organs capable of detecting air pressure differentials created by moving objects in complete darkness, haven't been diminished. I find this almost confrontational in the best possible way. You have an animal that has lived in human homes for 100 generations, that has been fed by human hands, that has slept beside human bodies, that has been handled from birth. And the thing that makes it a predator? The specific, precise, million-year refined toolkit for locating, approaching, catching, and killing prey is still there, fully operational. Not as instinct that needs to be triggered by deprivation or training. Just there, running in the background every waking moment, like a program that never fully closes. Researchers who study feral cat populations, cats that were born domestic and have returned to living wild, consistently find that the transition takes essentially no time at all. A domestic cat that loses access to human provisioning does not experience a learning curve on hunting. Within days, sometimes within hours, the full predatory behavioral sequence is operational. The claws that spent months being carefully trimmed are immediately deployed. The ambush strategy that looks like play behavior in a domestic context reveals itself as actual ambush strategy. Feral cats establish territories, hunt systematically, avoid humans, and raise offspring that are progressively wilder with each generation. 2 generations from a domestic cat, and you have an animal that is functionally indistinguishable in its behavior from a wildcat that has never been near a human settlement. Remove a dog from human society, and what you have is a deeply confused social animal, without the instincts to thrive independently. Dogs that go feral form packs and scavenge. They revert not to wolf behavior, but to a kind of degraded, disoriented, in-between state that is difficult to classify. The domestication went too deep, rewired too much. There is no wolf left to return to. The cat retains the blueprint, every line of it. The domestication overlay sits on top of the predatory architecture, like a thin layer of sediment over bedrock, detectable by genetic analysis, real in its effects on behavior around humans, and yet superficial enough that the rock beneath shows through at every edge. This is what makes the question of what a domestic cat actually is so genuinely difficult to answer with the tools we normally use for taxonomic classification. It's not simply that cats are less domesticated than dogs in some quantitative sense, as if domestication were a linear scale from wild to tame, and cats just happen to sit closer to the wild end. It's that cats domesticated through a mechanism that left the animal's fundamental nature structurally intact, and that the result is an organism that occupies a biological category for which we don't really have a clean name. Because here is what Warren's observation about semi-domestication actually implies, when you follow it to its logical conclusion.
If the only significant genomic changes are in fear thresholds and reward-associated memory, if the predatory hardware is unchanged, if the social cognition was never rerouted toward humans, if the gene pool stayed wide enough that wild and domestic individuals can still mate and produce fertile offspring anywhere their ranges overlap, then what, precisely, is the cat's relationship to domestication? It is not what we typically mean when we say an animal is domesticated. It is something more specific and more interesting. The cat modified its relationship to a specific threat, humans, while maintaining every other aspect of its biology in the exact form that natural selection had produced for life as a solitary desert predator. It didn't become a different animal. It became an animal that no longer feared a particular kind of large primate. And once you see it that way, a different and somewhat unsettling question surfaces. One that researchers have been circling around for the last decade. Not how domesticated is the cat, but something more fundamental. What actually defines domestication? And does the cat fit the definition at all? That turns out to be a question that the field of domestication biology has been struggling to answer even before cats became the test case for it. And the answer, when you look closely, reveals something surprising not just about cats, but about what domestication actually does to an animal, and what it doesn't. Sometime around 2012, a veterinary geneticist named Leslie Lyons was reviewing the compiled behavioral data from a series of domestic cat genome studies when she stopped at a result that didn't fit cleanly into any existing framework. The data showed, with statistical clarity, that domestic cats and African wildcats were so genetically similar that standard domestication metrics, the ones developed to classify dogs, cattle, horses, produced results that kept sliding toward ambiguous. By the metrics designed to measure how domesticated an animal was, the domestic cat was scoring somewhere between wild and in the early stages of domestication. Not fully in either category, not comfortably in any established one. Lyons, who leads the feline genetics laboratory at the University of Missouri, later described this as one of those moments when you realize the tool you're using wasn't designed for what you're trying to measure. The domestication metrics existed to describe a process with clear directionality. Wild animal, captured, bred, reshaped, domesticated. The cat data kept describing something that didn't follow that trajectory. The numbers were not wrong. The framework was just the wrong shape for the animal it was being applied to. This is not a minor methodological quibble. It goes to the heart of what domestication actually is, biologically. For most of the 20th century, the definition seemed obvious. A domestic animal is one that has been selectively bred by humans for human purposes, resulting in morphological, physiological, and behavioral differences from its wild ancestor. By that definition, you can rank animals on a spectrum. The dog is deeply domesticated. Thousands of generations of intense selective breeding, dramatic morphological divergence from the wolf, fundamental rewiring of social cognition. The horse, somewhat less so. The rabbit, even less. The goldfish, selectively bred for color but unchanged in most other respects, occupies a strange middle ground. And the cat. The cat kept producing measurements that didn't sit anywhere cleanly on the spectrum. Because the cat, as lions and others in the field have increasingly argued, didn't go through the process that the definition was built to describe. It went through something adjacent to it, something that produced some of the outcomes of domestication: reduced fear of humans, ability to live in close proximity, capacity to form affiliative bonds, without the mechanism. No capture, no selective breeding program, no human-controlled population management, just an ecological niche and 10,000 years of natural selection operating on a behavioral threshold. The technical term that has emerged for this category is proto-domestic, or more commonly, commensal. But neither term fully captures what makes the cat's situation strange. Proto-domestic implies that the process was just getting started, that full domestication was the endpoint it was moving toward. Commensal describes the ecological relationship accurately, but says nothing about the genetic and behavioral outcomes. What the cat actually represents is something that the field is still working to name correctly. An animal that completed a transition into human society through a pathway that bypassed the standard mechanism entirely, and that arrived at a stable equilibrium, call it semi-domestication, that shows no obvious pressure to deepen further in either direction. And here is the observation that makes this concrete in a way that no amount of genomic data quite manages to. Walk through any city in the world, Cairo, Istanbul, Athens, Tokyo, Mexico City, and you will find cats. Not in houses, outside. In alleys, in markets, on rooftops, around fish stalls, in the ruins of old buildings. Thousands of them in some cities. Hundreds of thousands. These are not feral dogs, which cluster around garbage and display the confused social behavior of animals whose domestication went too deep to survive without humans. These are cats that live entirely on their own terms, hunt for themselves, form loose social groups of their own choosing, and interact with the humans around them on a completely voluntary and entirely self-determined basis. They accept food when offered. They walk away when they choose. They are not lost. They are not abandoned. They are living exactly as cats lived 10,000 years ago in the settlements of the Fertile Crescent, in proximity to humans, benefiting from that proximity, and retaining complete autonomy. Istanbul alone is estimated to have several 100,000 such cats. The city has lived alongside them for so long that they have become part of the urban identity, subject of a celebrated documentary film, cared for by thousands of individual residents who leave food and water at specific spots, neither fully wild nor fully owned. A famous orange tabby named Tombili, who was known for sitting on an Istanbul sidewalk in a casual, almost human posture, became so beloved after his death in 2016 that residents petitioned for a statue in his honor, and got one. Not because he was domesticated, because he chose to be there, and chose his own manner of being. This is not sentiment. This is the biological reality of a commensal animal expressing its commensal nature. The Istanbul street cat and the cat on a couch in London are, genetically, doing the same thing, occupying the human niche on terms they set themselves. Now, the moment when that niche went global,
Because the cats of the Fertile Crescent didn't stay in the Fertile Crescent. They spread across the ancient world in a dispersal event that was entirely passive from the cat's perspective, entirely unplanned from the human's perspective, and entirely consequential for both. The mechanism was grain, specifically the grain trade. As agricultural civilizations expanded, first through the Levant, then into Egypt, then across the Mediterranean, they moved grain in ships. And wherever grain moved in bulk, rodents followed. Rats and mice colonized the holds of ancient merchant vessels with the same enthusiasm they had colonized Neolithic grain stores, and with the same destructive effect on the cargo. A Mediterranean grain shipment that took 3 weeks to cross open water could arrive with a significant percentage of the load compromised by rodents that had bred during the voyage. Ancient Egyptian records from the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 4,000 years ago, show evidence of cats being present aboard Nile cargo vessels. Cats first appeared in Egyptian art around 4,000 years ago, and ancient Egyptian records document that cats were kept on grain ships to protect cargo from rodent damage. The Egyptians inherited a system that had already evolved organically from the agricultural settlements of the Fertile Crescent, where cats had been keeping grain stores clear of rodents for thousands of years before Egypt's cat cult crystallized into formal religion. In Egypt, the cat's role formalized into something culturally central in a way it never quite reached elsewhere. The goddess Bastet, depicted first as a lioness, then refined into the cat-headed deity of protection, fertility, and domestic harmony, became one of the most widely worshipped figures in the Egyptian pantheon. The city of Bubastis in the Nile Delta served as her cult center, and the annual festival held there was, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, the largest and most attended religious celebration in all of Egypt. 700,000 people, he claimed, gathered at Bubastis for the festival. Herodotus was occasionally unreliable on exact numbers, but the scale he described, a city defined by its devotion to a cat goddess, was corroborated by the archaeology. Excavations at Bubastis uncovered hundreds of thousands of mummified cats, some offered as religious dedications, some bred specifically for sacrifice, in a practice that ran for nearly 2,000 years. The Egyptians also attempted, famously and unsuccessfully, to restrict the export of cats. Under certain periods of Egyptian law, removing a cat from the country was prohibited, and agents were reportedly sent abroad to purchase or recover cats that had been smuggled out. The logic was religious and economic simultaneously. Cats were sacred, and they were strategically valuable aboard ships. The smuggling succeeded anyway. By 3,000 years ago, cats were established in the ancient Near East, in Greece, in Persia. By 2,000 years ago, Roman-era records document cats in Britain, in Germany, in the households of the upper classes across the empire. The Romans did not use traps or terriers to control rodents. They used cats. Military garrisons across the Roman frontier, from Hadrian's Wall to the Danube, have produced cat bones in archaeological excavations. Not wild cats, domestic cats. Animals that traveled with the legions. A genetic study led by Eva Maria Geigel at the Institut Jacques Monod in Paris, published in 2017 in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, traced this dispersal using ancient DNA from cat remains excavated at archaeological sites across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Geigel's team analyzed mitochondrial DNA from over 200 ancient cat specimens spanning 9,000 years of human history. Two major waves of expansion emerged from the data. The first wave moved out of the Fertile Crescent into Europe during the Neolithic period, carried by the expansion of agriculture itself. The second wave, larger, faster, reaching further, moved out of Egypt along the maritime trade routes of the ancient world, beginning around 3,000 years ago. The two waves were genetically distinct. Neolithic European cats carried Near Eastern mitochondrial lineages, while the later wave carried Egyptian ones. Viking burial sites in northern Germany, dating to roughly 800 CE, yielded cat remains that carried Egyptian mitochondrial lineages, meaning that the cats of the Norse world traced their ancestry, through thousands of miles of maritime trade, back to the Nile Delta. What strikes me about this dispersal is that the cats did not experience it as a migration. They didn't choose to go to Scandinavia. They chose to be on a boat where the mice were. Every individual cat at every step of that 10,000-mile expansion across the ancient world was making the same calculation that the first African wildcats made in the Fertile Crescent. There is food near these humans, and these humans are not a threat worth fleeing.
The global spread of the domestic cat is the commensal strategy, running itself out to its logical conclusion across the entire human trading network. And then, periodically, at every point in that network, some cats stepped back off the boat and went the other direction. Biologists studying feral cat populations on remote islands have documented what happens when that reversal occurs without any of the constraints of the mainland world. On islands across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, places where cats were introduced by sailors and researchers and then left without active management, feral populations established themselves and revealed, in conditions that functioned almost like a controlled experiment, exactly what lies beneath the domestication overlay. The pattern is consistent across every documented case. Within 1 or 2 generations of losing contact with human provisioning and socialization, feral cats display the full behavioral repertoire of free-living wildcats. Hunting efficiency is immediate. There is no learning curve, because the predatory sequence was never dismantled. Territorial behavior expands to match what a wildcat of similar body mass would occupy in comparable habitat. Fear of humans, which in domestic cats is modulated by early socialization, returns rapidly. Social structure reorganizes around the loose, facultatively social arrangements typical of wildcats, rather than the proximity-tolerant groupings of domestic cats near human settlements. Feral cat populations on islands without native terrestrial predators have produced some of the most dramatic conservation crises in modern biology, because the prey species they encounter, seabirds, ground-nesting birds, reptiles, evolved in the absence of any mammalian predator and have no behavioral defenses against one. The hunting efficiency of a feral cat in that environment is not impaired by 10,000 years of domestication. The animal arrives as what it always was, a highly specialized ambush predator with a sensory suite and behavioral repertoire that neither the prey species nor the island ecosystem has any prior experience navigating. This reversion, documented across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, in the Australian outback, in the Scottish Highlands where feral domestic cats now threaten to hybridize the native wildcat population out of existence, is perhaps the most powerful single demonstration of what semi-domestication actually means. The cat didn't lose its wildness during 10,000 years of living with humans. It folded it up and kept it, latent and intact, under a layer of behavioral modifications so shallow that 1 or 2 generations is enough to shed it entirely. Researchers studying feral cat populations have documented that even the first-generation feral, an animal that was handled and fed as a kitten, shows dramatic behavioral reversion within months of losing contact with humans. The hunting sequence, which in a domestic context looks like play, reveals itself immediately as the functional predatory behavior it always was. The cat is not learning how to be wild. It never forgot. This is what makes the feral reversal biologically significant beyond the conservation concerns it raises. And it does raise serious conservation concerns, with outdoor and feral cats estimated to kill between 1 and 4 billion birds annually in the United States alone,
making them one of the leading human-associated causes of bird mortality on the planet. At a deeper level, what it reveals is that the domestic cat's behavioral modifications are conditional, not fixed. They exist as long as the environmental conditions that maintain them, human proximity, provisioning, early socialization, continue to be present. Remove those conditions, and the genome expresses itself differently. The predator resurfaces. No other domestic animal shows this. The domestic pig gone feral does develop thicker skin and tusks over several generations, a genuine morphological reversion, but the process takes generations and is never complete. The domestic horse gone feral, like the Mustangs of North America or the Brumbies of Australia, develops social structures and behavioral patterns that resemble wild equid behavior. But the animals remain fundamentally different in temperament and stress response from truly wild horses. In every case, thousands of years of selective breeding left marks that even complete removal from human society cannot fully erase. The cat erases them in a generation, which means they were never truly permanent. Which means that what we call domestication in the cat is, at a mechanistic level, something more like a negotiated behavioral state, one that the animal maintains as long as the terms of the negotiation are being met, and withdraws from the moment they aren't. Now, if the cat is maintaining a negotiated behavioral state rather than expressing an irreversible genetic transformation, the obvious question becomes, what does the cat actually experience on its side of the negotiation? What is happening inside the cat's nervous system when it chooses to stay near humans rather than flee? This is the question that brought researchers studying human-animal social bonding to feline neuroscience, a field that, until recently, was something of a scientific afterthought. Dogs got the attention. Dogs had been bred for social cognition, after all, so their neural responses to human interaction seemed like the interesting case. Cats were assumed to be cognitively simpler in the relevant respects. That assumption turned out to be wrong, in ways that continue to surprise researchers.
In 2019, researchers at Oregon State University published behavioral work showing that cats, when given a choice between food, sense stimulation, toy interaction, and social interaction with a human, chose human social interaction as the primary category of preference across the majority of individual cats tested. This wasn't a marginal result. The study tested 50 cats in both shelter and household settings, and across both populations, the majority of animals preferentially sought human interaction over the other stimuli, including food. An animal that has been feeding itself by hunting for millions of years preferring social contact with a primate over a food reward is not a trivial finding. It suggests that something in the cat's social behavior toward humans is not simply a conditioned response to provisioning. There is something else operating. The lead researcher, Kristen Vitale, described her surprise at the result in terms that echo the surprise Driscoll felt looking at his phylogenetic trees. The expectation had been that cats would prioritize food, that the human-cat relationship was, at its core, transactional, with the cat present for the caloric benefit and indifferent to the relationship itself. What the data showed was more complicated. A significant proportion of cats were choosing the company of a human over food. That preference doesn't have a clean explanation in the framework of domestication as transaction. Further behavioral research at the University of Lincoln had already established, several years earlier, that domestic cats form genuine attachment bonds with their human caregivers that parallel, in their structural characteristics, the attachment bonds observed between human infants and primary caregivers. Researchers used the strange situation test, a standard paradigm in developmental psychology for measuring attachment security, adapted for cats. The results showed that many cats display what attachment theory classifies as secure base behavior, using the human as a reference point in a novel environment, showing distress when separated, calming preferentially upon reunion with their specific person over reunion with a stranger. This is not the behavior of an animal that is present purely for the caloric benefit. Secure attachment requires a genuine internal representation of the attachment figure, a cognitive model of a specific individual as a source of safety and comfort. The cat has built that model. Not for all humans, the attachment is specific, formed through repeated positive interaction with a particular person. Not through the broad social bonding that dogs form with humans generally, but through selective, individual-specific bonding that, in the wild, the African wildcat deploys during the breeding season and the rearing of young. The cat, it appears, has repurposed its existing capacity for selective social bonding, evolved for a very different context, and aimed it at the human it lives with. Research into what cats actually perceive when they look at their human caregivers has produced equally unexpected results. Cats recognize their owner's voice with high specificity, able to distinguish it from a stranger's voice at rates well above chance, and show facial recognition that includes sensitivity to emotional expression. A study published in 2015 found that cats altered their behavior in response to their owner's emotional facial expression, approaching more quickly and purring more when the owner displayed positive affect, and showing avoidance or stress behaviors in response to negative affect. Importantly, this response was observed with owners, but not with strangers displaying the same expressions. The cat isn't reading human emotional states in general. It's reading the emotional state of a specific person it has learned to know. I find this almost moving, in a way I didn't expect when I started looking at the neuroscience. The African wildcat, a solitary desert predator, built for ambush, evolved for independence. Genetically unchanged in its predatory hardware after 10,000 years of living with us, has repurposed its capacity for selective social bonding to form genuine, specific, neurologically real attachments to individual humans. Not because it was bred to, not because its genome was redesigned to make it socially oriented toward our species, because the individuals that formed those bonds survived better in the human niche, and their capacity for bonding, already present for other purposes, was available to be redirected. Evolution doesn't build new machinery when existing machinery can be repurposed. The cat didn't need a new social brain. It had one. It just aimed it differently. And this is where the question that Lyons was sitting with, what is domestication if it doesn't fit the standard definition, opens into something bigger. Because the cat's story isn't just an interesting edge case in the taxonomy of human-animal relationships. It's a window into the question of what cooperation between species actually requires and what it costs. Every other domestic animal paid a price. The dog gave up its independent social world for a position inside the human one. The horse gave up its flight response, or rather, thousands of years of selective breeding dampened it enough that the animal could function in human contexts without constant terror. The cow gave up its size, its aggression, its wild complexity. They were reshaped, fundamentally. The process was irreversible. You cannot undomesticate a border collie. There is no wild ancestor left inside it to return to, because the breeding programs that created it went so deep that the wolf it descended from is no longer accessible in any meaningful biological sense. The cat paid almost nothing. It lowered one threshold, the threat assessment of humans, and kept everything else. It brought its full predatory self into the arrangement, its ambush instinct, its retractable weaponry, its night vision, its independence, its capacity to survive without human provisioning the moment provisioning stops. The entire deal it made with human civilization was, I will not flee from you. Everything else is mine.
And that deal has held for 10,000 years. There is something in this that deserves more than a footnote in the history of domestication. The standard story of that history is a story of human mastery, of our species looking at the wild world and deciding, with extraordinary patience and ingenuity, which parts of it could be brought into our sphere and reshaped to serve our needs. Aurochs became cattle, wolves became companions, jungle birds became chickens. The story is about human intention exerted over nature and nature yielding. The cat breaks that story. It entered human civilization not because we exerted mastery over it, but because it calculated, across generations, through the merciless logic of natural selection, that proximity to humans was worth tolerating. It made the same cost-benefit assessment that any wild animal makes when evaluating a new environment, and it came back positive. The grain stores were good hunting. The humans were manageable. The arrangement was acceptable. And so it stayed. And what stayed with it, what never left, what 10,000 years of sleeping beside fires and eating from bowls and being carried on ships across oceans never erased, is the wildcat that made that first calculation. It's still there, in the freeze before the pounce, in the eyes that see in the dark, in the animal that can, in a single generation, leave the apartment and become something that ground-nesting seabirds on a remote island have no defense against.
The domestic cat is a wild animal that decided at some point in the Neolithic that humans were an interesting feature of its environment rather than a threat. It has not changed its mind. It has not changed much else. Every cat that has ever sat in a sunlit window, watching the street outside with an expression that tells you almost nothing about what it's thinking, that animal is doing exactly what its ancestors did in the grain stores of the ancient Fertile Crescent. It is present. It is watching. It is deciding, continuously, that the arrangement still works. That is not domestication in any sense the word was built to describe. It is something rarer. A species that encountered civilization and negotiated its own terms, that walked into the human world with its wildness intact and has been living there on precisely those terms ever since. The cat was never conquered. It arrived.